There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the moments before war, a silence so thick it seems to press against your chest, so complete that every breath feels like an intrusion into something sacred and terrible. On January 16, 1991, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, 500,000 American troops sat in that silence, scattered across the Saudi desert like seeds planted in foreign soil, waiting for a war that would begin with the sunrise and redefine everything they thought they knew about combat. These men and women, boys and girls, really many of them barely old enough to vote, let alone to kill, had been told they were about to face the fourth largest army in the world, a battle-hardened Iraqi force that had spent 8 years grinding through the meat grinder of the Iran-Iraq war. They had been told to prepare for chemical weapons, for human wave attacks, for the kind of warfare that turned deserts into graveyards. And so they sat in the darkness, checking their gas masks for the 100th time, writing letters they hoped would never be mailed, and carrying the weight of a question that had haunted America for nearly 2 decades. Would this be Vietnam all over again, or something entirely different? What makes Desert Storm so paradoxical, so uniquely haunting in the annals of American military history is that it represented both the pinnacle of technological warfare and the timeless reality of human fear. These soldiers carried night vision goggles that could turn midnight into noon, satellite communications that could call down precision strikes from aircraft flying at 40,000 feet, and weapon systems so advanced they seemed pulled from science fiction. Yet for all that technology, for all the billions of dollars spent on smart bombs and stealth fighters and computerized battle management systems, the success of the operation still depended on the same fundamental elements that decided the fate of Omaha Beach and Guadalcanal: the courage of individual human beings, the bonds of brotherhood forged under fire, and the terrible, beautiful capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when everything they love depends on it. Stephen E. Ambrose understood this truth better than most when he wrote in Citizen Soldiers that in every generation, ordinary Americans are called upon to shoulder weapons and carry not just ammunition and rations, but the weight of a nation's hope for swift justice, for righteous victory, for a war that could be won without losing what makes us human in the process. But there was something else these soldiers carried into the desert, something heavier than any rifle or rucksack. And Tim O'Brien gave it a name in the things they carried: the intangible weight of memory, of history, of ghosts that refused to stay buried. These young Americans carried M16s and Kevlar helmets and MRE rations. Yes, but they also carried the ghosts of Vietnam, the phantom weight of 58,000 names etched into black granite in Washington, D.C., the fear that they, too, might come home to a nation that didn't know how to welcome them back, or worse, that they might not come home at all. They carried letters from mothers and fathers who remembered watching body bags unloaded on the evening news, who had seen what war did to their older brothers and uncles, and who now had to watch their own children march toward the sound of guns. They carried the knowledge, the terrible, unavoidable knowledge, that Saddam Hussein possessed chemical weapons and had already proven his willingness to use them, that at any moment the wind could shift and carry death in the form of invisible gas, and that their only protection was a rubber mask and a prayer that the seal would hold. They carried all of this into the desert, and they carried one more thing: the question of whether they would measure up, whether they possessed the same steel their grandfathers had shown on D-Day, whether they could prove that America still had the will to fight and the strength to win. Operation Desert Storm was never just about liberating Kuwait, though that was the mission written on the operational orders and briefed in the command tents. It was about exorcising demons, about proving to the world and to ourselves that Vietnam had been an aberration rather than a prophecy. That American military power, when properly unleashed, properly supported, properly led, could achieve decisive victory without sinking into the quagmire of endless guerrilla warfare and moral ambiguity. It was about answering a question that had haunted the Pentagon and the White House and living rooms across America for nearly 20 years. Can a war be won without destroying the warriors who fight it? Can young men and women be sent into the furnace of combat and emerge not just victorious, but whole? Or does every war, no matter how just the cause or swift the victory, exact a price that cannot be calculated in casualties and medals? A price paid in nightmares and survivors' guilt and the slow erosion of the soul. In 48 hours of ground combat, just 2 days that felt like 2 lifetimes, Desert Storm would provide an answer. But like all answers born in war, it would prove far more complicated, far more costly, and far more haunting than anyone standing in that desert darkness could possibly imagine. The final hours before H-hour possess a quality that defies adequate description, a stretched and distorted sense of time where minutes feel like hours, and hours collapse into seconds, where every action becomes both routine and ritualistic, where men perform familiar tasks with hands that shake just slightly, betraying the fear they refuse to acknowledge aloud. In those last precious hours before the air campaign began, pilots sat in ready rooms writing letters they desperately hoped would never be delivered, choosing words carefully, because these might be the last words their children ever read from them, struggling to explain love and duty and sacrifice to people who had never heard the sound of enemy fire or felt the weight of a bomb release lever under their thumb. Ground troops checked their gas masks with an obsessive intensity that bordered on madness, testing seals again and again because, unlike bullets or shrapnel, threats you could see coming, threats you could fight, chemical weapons offered only the horror of invisible death, of convulsions and suffocation, of dying while your brothers watched helplessly through the lenses of their own masks. Commanders sat in tactical operations centers, staring at maps and satellite imagery, knowing that in 48 hours everything would be different, that the careful plans and contingencies they had developed over months of preparation would collide with the chaos of actual combat, and that some of the men under their command, men whose names they knew, whose families they had met, whose dreams and fears they understood, would not survive to see the sunset on the second day. What separated these soldiers from every generation of warriors who came before them was the burden of preemptive knowledge, the psychological weight of certainty without the mercy of ignorance. Their grandfathers at Normandy had known war was coming, yes, but they hadn't watched it approach minute by minute on 24-hour news coverage, hadn't studied detailed intelligence briefings about the enemy's order of battle and capabilities, hadn't calculated their own odds of survival with the cold precision of actuarial science. These soldiers of Desert Storm had watched the crisis unfold on CNN in real time, had listened to Saddam Hussein's threats broadcast globally, had seen the poison gas attacks against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, had done the math and understood exactly what they were facing. They knew the Iraqi Republican Guard had been hardened by 8 years of brutal warfare. They knew Saddam possessed one of the largest armies in the world, dug into prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. They knew about the chemical weapons, the biological agents, the Scud missiles that could rain down death from the sky. And they knew, with a certainty that made sleep impossible, that within hours they would discover whether all their training, all their technology, all their carefully constructed plans would be enough, or whether the desert would become another graveyard for American dreams of swift, decisive victory. The silent terror of chemical warfare hung over everything like a toxic cloud, invisible but omnipresent, poisoning every breath with the possibility that it might be the last clean air they would ever taste. Every soldier had been trained in MOP gear, mission-oriented protective posture, those suffocating rubber suits that turned the human body into a sealed container, trapping heat and sweat and fear inside, while theoretically keeping nerve agents and mustard gas outside. They had practiced the drills until they could don the gear in under minutes, had learned to recognize the symptoms of exposure, The pinpoint pupils, the uncontrolled drooling, the seizures that meant death was seconds away, and they had been issued atropine injectors to stab into their thighs if the alarm sounded. But they all understood, with a clarity that no training exercise could fully convey, that the mask was really just a thin rubber barrier between life and an agonizing death. That a single tear in the seal or crack in the filter meant convulsions and blindness and drowning in your own fluids while your friends watched helplessly. The helplessness was perhaps the worst part, unlike a gunshot wound that a medic could treat. Unlike a broken bone that could be splinted, chemical exposure offered no middle ground between perfect protection and excruciating death. You either sealed the mask in time or you died choking on your own tongue, and no amount of courage or training or brotherhood could change that fundamental, terrifying mathematics. In these final hours, the mask of military discipline began to crack just slightly, revealing the frightened human beings beneath the uniforms and bravado. A 19-year-old kid from Texas, call him Jimmy, though that wasn't his real name, spent 20 minutes patiently teaching his best friend how to properly seal a gas mask, checking the straps again and again, making sure the filter was secure, because they both knew that in the chaos of a chemical attack there would be no time for second chances, no opportunity for do-overs. Somewhere in the Saudi darkness, an F-15 pilot sat alone in his cockpit, engines silent, and kissed his wedding ring before tucking it into his flight suit pocket. A small ritual of love and hope and desperate prayer that he would live to place it back on his finger when this was over. A Marine sergeant stood before his platoon, giving final instructions in a voice that remained steady and strong, refusing to let his men see the tremor in his hands or the fear in his eyes. Because leadership meant carrying the weight alone, meant being the rock others could cling to when the storm broke, even when your own foundation felt like sand. These small moments of vulnerability and humanity, hidden in the spaces between official orders and tactical briefings, revealed the essential paradox that would define Desert Storm, that the most precise weapons ever created, guided by satellites orbiting in space and computers processing millions of calculations per second, still required human beings to press the trigger and live with what followed. The historical echoes were impossible to ignore. The ghosts of past wars whispering from the shadows of memory. The dread these soldiers felt was the same dread their grandfathers had known on the transport ships approaching Omaha Beach. The same cold fear that gripped Marines before the landing at Guadalcanal. The same gut-wrenching anticipation that has preceded every battle since men first learned to organize violence into armies and campaigns. Technology had changed the tactics. Smart bombs instead of artillery barrages, night vision instead of flares, satellite communications instead of radio. But technology had not changed. Could never change the human heart under fire. Fear still tasted the same. Courage still required the same impossible act of will. Brotherhood still forged the same unbreakable bonds. The weapons were different, the battlefield was different, even the enemy was different. But the fundamental experience of the soldier remained timeless and universal, a thread connecting every generation of warriors across centuries and continents. In a few hours, when the first bombs fell on Baghdad and the air lit up with tracer fire and explosions, these soldiers of Desert Storm would join that ancient fraternity, would cross the threshold that separates those who have seen combat from those who have only imagined it, and they would discover, as every generation before them discovered, that nothing, absolutely nothing, can prepare you for the moment when theory becomes reality and the shooting actually starts. At precisely 3 o'clock in the morning on January 17, 1991, the night sky over Baghdad erupted in a display of violence, so concentrated, so overwhelming, so utterly without precedent in the history of warfare that those who witnessed it struggled for years afterward to find adequate words to describe what they had seen. The darkness shattered into fragments of green tracer fire and orange explosions, Cruise missiles streaked through the air like malevolent meteors. And the ancient city that had stood for millennia at the crossroads of civilization became the epicenter of the most sophisticated aerial assault ever conceived by human minds and executed by human hands. This was not the carpet bombing of World War II, not the rolling thunder of Vietnam with its measured escalation and political constraints. This was something entirely new, a symphony of destruction conducted with surgical precision, where every instrument played its part in perfect synchronization, where satellites and computers and laser-guided weapons combined to create a kind of warfare that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet for all its technological sophistication, for all the billions of dollars of research and development that made it possible, Operation Desert Storm's opening strike still depended on individual pilots climbing into cockpits, strapping themselves into machines designed to kill, and flying into hostile airspace where a single mistake, a single malfunction, a single moment of bad luck could mean death. The F-117 stealth pilots experienced a particular kind of loneliness that few other warriors have ever known. Flying alone through the darkness in aircraft so technologically advanced, they seemed to belong to the future rather than the present, navigating by the green glow of instruments while Baghdad slept beneath them, unaware that death approached on silent wings. These pilots carried bombs that could change the course of history if they hit their designated targets: command bunkers, communications centers, air defense headquarters, or potentially start World War III if guidance systems failed and ordnance fell on hospitals or embassies or residential neighborhoods. The weight of that responsibility pressed down like physical force, because unlike the bomber crews of previous wars who released their payloads in formation and shared the moral burden collectively, these stealth pilots flew solo missions where every decision, every course correction, every weapon release belonged to them alone. They were assassins in the sky, striking from invisibility against an enemy who couldn't see them coming. And the terrible efficiency of their mission, the ability to destroy with such precision and such one-sided advantage, created a kind of guilt that would haunt many of them long after the parades ended and the medals tarnished. War is supposed to be a contest, a struggle between roughly equal forces where courage and skill determine the outcome. But this felt less like combat and more like execution, and the moral weight of that distinction would prove heavier than any bomb they carried. From the ground, the spectacle possessed a terrible beauty that seared itself into the memories of everyone who witnessed it, a visual experience so overwhelming that it transcended horror and approached something almost sublime. Soldiers stationed in defensive positions along the Saudi border watched the horizon light up like a thunderstorm made of metal and fire, watched the sky fill with streaks of light as missiles found their targets, watched explosions bloom like deadly flowers against the darkness. The sound followed seconds later, a rolling, continuous thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that vibrated in your chest and rattled your teeth and made conversation impossible. Some men cheered, caught up in the raw spectacle of American military power unleashed without restraint. Others stood in silence, awed and horrified by the magnitude of destruction being visited upon an enemy they had never met, upon soldiers who might be just as frightened and far from home as they were themselves. The emotional response was complex and contradictory, a mixture of pride and shame, of satisfaction and sorrow, of relief that the waiting was finally over and dread for what would come next. War reveals itself in moments like these, not as the clean, heroic narrative of movies and books, but as something far more ambiguous and troubling, a necessary evil that stains everyone it touches, even those who fight for the right. Reasons and win decisive victories. The Apache helicopter, pilots who conducted the first strikes against Iraqi radar installations, discovered firsthand the surreal guilt that accompanies one-sided technological superiority, the psychological cost of destroying an enemy who never had a chance to fight back. They approached their targets in darkness, using thermal imaging systems that turned the night into day, identifying radar dishes and command vehicles with perfect clarity, while remaining invisible to the Iraqis sleeping beside their equipment. The strikes were surgical, professional, devastatingly effective. A textbook execution of tactics developed through years of training and billions in research and development. Yet afterward, flying back toward base as the sun began to rise, many of these pilots felt something unexpected and deeply troubling. One would later describe it in words that captured the moral ambiguity of modern warfare better than any strategic analysis or operational report. It felt like murder, even though it was war. The distinction between legitimate military action and something darker, something that violated an unspoken code of warrior ethics, had blurred in ways that training never prepared them for. They had done their duty, accomplished their mission, potentially saved countless American lives by eliminating air defenses before the main assault began. Yet the ease of it, the absolute lack of danger or resistance, the way they had killed men who never saw them coming, left a residue of shame that no amount of rational justification could fully wash away. General Norman Schwarzkopf had gambled everything on a 48-hour window, a calculated risk that air power alone could break the will of the Iraqi military before ground forces ever crossed the border. And every pilot understood that their individual missions were pieces of a larger strategy that put their lives on the line to save the lives of infantry soldiers who would follow. This was the essential bargain of modern combined arms warfare, that airmen would fly into the teeth of enemy defenses, would accept the risks of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery, and the possibility of ejecting over hostile territory, because every radar installation destroyed and every command bunker eliminated meant fewer casualties when the ground war began. The Wild Weasel pilots embraced this bargain with a particular kind of calculated courage, deliberately drawing enemy fire to reveal the locations of SAM sites, making themselves targets so that strike aircraft behind them could attack with greater safety. There existed an unspoken covenant among these pilots, a bond forged in the understanding that no one flies alone, even when separated by miles of hostile sky, that every mission depended on every other mission, that the death of any pilot diminished them all. When aircraft went down, and they did, though far fewer than anyone had dared hope, search and rescue helicopters penetrated deep into enemy territory to recover downed airmen. Because the covenant demanded it, because leaving anyone behind was unthinkable, because the brotherhood of warriors transcends rank and service branch and even the fear of death itself. Perhaps the most significant and least understood aspect of Desert Storm's air campaign was the moral weight carried by pilots who were trying, for the first time in American military history, to wage war with genuine precision and discrimination, to destroy military targets while minimizing civilian casualties in ways that Vietnam had made impossible and World War II had never even attempted. These pilots carried not just bombs, but the burden of a new kind of warrior's conscience, one shaped by laser guidance systems and real-time intelligence and rules of engagement that demanded verification of targets before weapons release. They understood that every bomb they dropped would be analyzed afterward, that CNN cameras would film the results, that the entire world would judge America not just on whether they won, but on how they won. This created a paradox at the heart of the air campaign. The most devastating aerial assault in history was also the most carefully controlled, the most legally constrained, the most morally conscious. Pilots had to balance the tactical necessity of destroying enemy capabilities with the strategic necessity of maintaining moral high ground, and that balance required split-second decisions in cockpits, traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Decisions that would be dissected and debated and second-guessed for decades to come. The terrible beauty of what they accomplished, the unprecedented combination of overwhelming force and remarkable restraint, would reshape modern warfare in ways both profound and troubling, creating expectations and precedents that future generations of warriors would struggle to meet. While the pilots fought their war in the sky, the infantry experienced something far more psychologically corrosive than combat itself: the torture of waiting, of watching, of knowing that the real battle had not yet started, and that when it did, all the precision strikes and technological superiority in the world might not be enough to save them from what Saddam Hussein had promised would be the mother of all battles. These soldiers crouched in foxholes and armored vehicles along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, listening to the distant thunder of explosions, watching the horizon flicker with the light of a war they could hear but not fight. And the waiting gnawed at them in ways that actual combat sometimes does not. In combat, fear transforms into action. Adrenaline overrides thought. Training takes control of muscles and reflexes, and there is at least the illusion of agency, the sense that you can fight back and influence your own survival. But in waiting, there is only imagination, and imagination is a soldier's worst enemy, because it conjures scenarios more terrifying than reality ever delivers, because it replays every horror story from every previous war, because it transforms every shadow into a threat and every sound into the harbinger of chemical attack or artillery barrage or armored assault. The infantry waited, and in waiting, they fought a different kind of battle, one against their own minds, their own fears, their own desperate need to believe they would survive what was coming. The fear that haunted every foxhole and fighting position was not merely the fear of death, which soldiers learned to manage through training and dark humor and the statistical comfort that someone else will probably catch the bullet, but rather the fear of a particular kind of death that stripped away dignity and agency and reduced human beings to convulsing, suffocating meat. Saddam Hussein's threat of chemical warfare was not empty rhetoric. He had already used nerve agents against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to deploy weapons that violated every convention of warfare. And intelligence reports confirmed that Iraqi artillery units possessed shells filled with sarin and mustard gas. Every soldier had been issued a gas mask and trained in rapid donning procedures, but they all understood the brutal mathematics of chemical attack. If you got the mask on, within 9 seconds of the first alarm, you might survive. If it took 10 seconds, you probably wouldn't. And if the seal wasn't perfect, if the filter was damaged, if you had been sleeping when the attack came, then all the training in the world meant nothing. This was not the kind of death that soldiers could face with courage and defiance, not the clean trauma of bullets or shrapnel where a medic might save you and you might eventually heal. This was drowning in your own fluids, seizing uncontrollably while your brothers watched helplessly, dying in agony while your mind remained horribly aware until the very end. Some fears are so primal, so deeply wired into human survival instinct, that no amount of military discipline can fully suppress them. And the fear of poison gas reached into the most ancient parts of the brain, where reason holds no sway. While the pilots received the glory and the headlines, the real backbone of any military operation, the forgotten heroes whose names never appear in history books, worked with quiet professionalism in the shadows of the coming ground war. Medical units established field hospitals with surgical capabilities that rivaled many civilian trauma centers, preparing for mass casualties that everyone prayed would never materialize, stocking blood supplies and morphine and body bags in quantities that reflected the Pentagon's worst-case projections. Logistics troops performed miracles of supply chain management that military historians would later recognize as perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entire operation, moving mountains of fuel and ammunition and spare parts and food and water across hundreds of miles of desert, ensuring that when the ground offensive began, the armored spearheads would have everything they needed to sustain a rapid advance. Combat engineers worked through the nights under blackout conditions, marking lanes through minefields with meticulous care, understanding that a single mistake, a single mine overlooked, could mean the difference between a successful breach and a catastrophic traffic jam that would leave tanks and troops exposed to artillery fire. These men and women would never receive ticker tape parades or book deals or invitations to speak at military academies. But they understood something essential about warfare that the combat arms sometimes forget, that wars are won not just by those who fight, but by those who enable the fighters to reach the battlefield, supplied, supported, and ready for whatever hell awaits them, in the intimacy of shared danger and uncertain survival. Bonds formed between soldiers that transcended friendship and approached something closer to family, or perhaps something even deeper than family, something that has no civilian equivalent and can only be understood by those who have lived through it. Soldiers shared MRE rations not because they were hungry, but because the act of sharing created connection, transformed isolated individuals into a collective whole. They passed around photographs of wives and girlfriends and children and parents, showing each other the faces of the people they carried in their hearts, the reason they had to survive and make it home. Some prayed together, Christians and Jews and Muslims and atheists, all finding their own ways to confront mortality and search for meaning in the face of possible annihilation. The conversations were sometimes profound and sometimes trivial, ranging from discussions of mortality and purpose to debates about football teams and favorite movies. Because soldiers need both philosophy and distraction, both emotional depth and light-hearted escape, what mattered was not the content of these interactions, but the fact of them. The creation of family in sand and uncertainty. The transformation of strangers from different states and backgrounds and experiences into brothers who would die for each other if necessary. This is perhaps the most ancient and enduring truth of warfare, that soldiers do not fight primarily for abstract concepts like freedom or democracy or national interest, but for the men beside them, for the small circle of brothers who have become their whole world. The technological disconnect of Desert Storm created a surreal experience that no previous generation of soldiers had ever encountered, the ability to watch their own war being reported on television in real time, to see CNN correspondents broadcasting from Baghdad while they sat in Saudi Arabia preparing to invade, to experience a kind of double consciousness where they were simultaneously participants in history and spectators of it. During breaks in defensive preparations, soldiers gathered in tents around television sets powered by portable generators. Watching Bernard Shaw and Peter Arnett describe the air campaign from the Al Rashid Hotel, watching footage of their own airstrikes played back with expert commentary and analysis, creating a bizarre feedback loop where the war they were about to fight was already being narrated and interpreted before they had even crossed the border. Some found this comforting, a connection to home and normalcy in the midst of pre-combat anxiety. Others found it deeply unsettling, a violation of the psychological boundary that should exist between warriors and observers, between those who risk everything and those who watch safely from hotel balconies. The surrealism intensified when soldiers realized that Iraqi commanders might be watching the same broadcasts, that CNN was inadvertently providing intelligence about American operations, that the entire concept of operational security had been upended by satellite communications and 24-hour news cycles. War had always been chaotic and confusing, but this was a new kind of confusion, not the fog of battle, but the bizarre clarity of seeing your own war through the lens of media narratives and expert analysis before you had actually experienced it yourself. As the air campaign exceeded all expectations and intelligence reports confirmed that Iraqi forces were being systematically degraded, some soldiers began to experience an unexpected and somewhat troubling emotion, a kind of guilt or disappointment that the enemy they had spent months preparing to fight was crumbling before ground combat even began. They had trained for the worst-case scenario, had steeled themselves for battles that would test them to their absolute limits, had made peace with the possibility of death and injury and sacrifice. And now it appeared that all that psychological preparation might be unnecessary. The relief was profound and genuine. No one actually wanted to fight the mother of all battles. But underneath the relief lurked a more complicated feeling that soldiers rarely articulate publicly. They had been promised a test of their courage and capabilities, had been told they would face a formidable enemy that would require everything they had to overcome. And the rapid disintegration of Iraqi combat effectiveness created a strange sense of anticlimax. This was not cowardice or bloodlust, but rather the natural human response to preparing for an ordeal and then having that ordeal diminished or postponed. The psychological equivalent of training for a marathon and then being told the race has been shortened to a fun run. Combat veterans from Vietnam and previous conflicts had warned them that war is mostly boredom, punctuated by moments of terror. But no one had prepared them for the possibility that the terror might never fully materialize, that technological superiority might render their individual courage and sacrifice somewhat superfluous. Yet beneath all the advanced technology, beneath the satellite communications and precision weapons and real-time intelligence, the fundamental experience of the infantryman remained as timeless and universal as it had been for soldiers at Valley Forge and Gettysburg and the Somme. They were still cold at night when the desert temperature plummeted, still hungry when rations ran short, still exhausted from carrying heavy loads across difficult terrain, still homesick for families and lovers and the ordinary comforts of civilian life. They still dealt with minor injuries and equipment malfunctions and personality conflicts within their units. They still experienced the grinding fatigue of maintaining constant readiness, of sleeping in shifts, of never fully relaxing because the next alarm might signal the start of the ground war. They still felt the primal human fear of death and mutilation, still wondered whether they would prove brave when the moment came, still questioned whether the mission justified the risks they were being asked to take. Smart bombs and night vision goggles and armored vehicles had not changed these fundamental realities of military service, had not made soldiers any less vulnerable to fear or pain or doubt. The ancient truth remained unchanged across millennia of warfare, that soldiers endure not because they are superhuman, but because they are profoundly human, because they possess the courage to face their fears rather than transcend them, because they choose duty over comfort and brotherhood over self-preservation, knowing full well the cost such choices might exact. When the ground war finally began on February 24th, 1991, it unfolded with a speed and decisiveness that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The armored columns of the coalition forces slicing through Iraqi defensive positions like a heated blade through wax, encountering not the fanatical resistance that had been feared, but rather an army already shattered by weeks of relentless aerial bombardment, an enemy whose will to fight had been systematically destroyed before the first tank crossed the border. Within 48 hours of the ground offensive, Iraqi forces were in full retreat, abandoning their positions and their equipment, fleeing north toward Basra along Highway 80 in a desperate attempt to escape the envelopment that coalition forces were executing with textbook precision. What happened on that highway in the final hours of the war would become the most controversial and morally troubling image of American military efficiency, a stretch of road that would be forever known as the Highway of Death. Miles upon miles of destroyed vehicles, burned-out tanks and trucks and buses, a graveyard of metal and flesh that stretched toward the horizon, like a monument to the terrible arithmetic of absolute military superiority. The photographs and video footage that emerged from Highway 80 shocked the world and complicated the narrative of clean, surgical warfare that had defined the air campaign, because there is nothing clean or surgical about carbonized corpses in the driver's seats of incinerated vehicles. Nothing precise about the wholesale slaughter of an army in retreat. The moral reckoning that followed came not in Washington or at the United Nations, but in the minds and hearts of individual American pilots and ground forces who encountered the aftermath firsthand and struggled to reconcile what they had done with who they understood themselves to be. These soldiers and airmen had spent months preparing to fight the fourth largest army in the world, had been briefed on Iraqi military capabilities and shown intelligence estimates that painted a picture of a formidable adversary, had psychologically prepared themselves for the kind of warfare where victory would be uncertain and casualties would be heavy. Instead, they found themselves confronting not a fearsome enemy, but a routed, desperate, demoralized collection of human beings trying simply to survive, to escape, to get back home to their own families and lives. The uncomfortable face of absolute military superiority revealed itself in those moments. The realization that technological advantage and superior training and overwhelming firepower could create such an asymmetry that combat ceased to feel like combat and began to feel like something else entirely. Something that violated the unspoken rules that are supposed to govern warfare between professional armies. American pilots, who had bombed the retreating columns, later described their missions in language that revealed deep psychological distress, talking about fish in a barrel and turkey shoots, describing target-rich environments with a tone that suggested shame rather than satisfaction. The silence after the bombardment possessed a quality that veterans would struggle for years to articulate, an absence of sound so complete and so heavy with death that it seemed to physically press against you as you moved through the wreckage. Ground forces advancing along Highway 80 in the immediate aftermath walked through destruction so total, so comprehensive, so utterly without parallel in their experience that it seemed to belong to some nightmare version of reality rather than the world they had inhabited just days before. Vehicles were not merely destroyed, but obliterated, reduced to twisted sculptures of blackened metal, some still burning days after the attack. The smoke rising in dark columns that could be seen for miles across the flat desert landscape. The bodies, and there were so many bodies, presented evidence of death in forms that challenged the mind's ability to process and categorize, some remarkably intact, as if merely sleeping in positions of attempted escape. Others burned beyond recognition, transformed by fire and explosive force into shapes that barely registered as having once been human. American soldiers trained in urban warfare and close-quarters combat, prepared for the violence of bullets and explosives and hand-to-hand fighting, found themselves utterly unprepared for this, for destruction so complete it seemed inhuman in scale and effect. For the God's eye view of what modern military power looks like when unleashed without restraint against a helpless enemy, many soldiers later described feeling not triumph but a hollow confusion that bordered on existential crisis, a profound disconnect between the mission they thought they were executing and the reality they encountered on the ground. One Marine would later try to explain it in words that captured something essential about the psychological cost of one-sided warfare. We trained to fight the fourth largest army in the world. We found frightened kids who wanted to surrender. The Iraqis they encountered were not the battle-hardened veterans of 8 years of war with Iran, not the elite Republican Guard units they had been warned about, but rather conscripts who looked barely old enough to shave, skinny and exhausted and terrified. Many of them shoeless because they had been stealing boots from dead comrades, some so desperate for food and water they would have surrendered to a 10-year-old if that child had been carrying rations. These were not the faces of fanaticism or evil or military threat. These were the faces of young men who had been caught in the machinery of history and politics and violence, who wanted nothing more than to go home, who posed no more danger to American forces than prisoners in a holding camp. The psychological whiplash of preparing for existential combat and instead finding helpless surrender created a kind of moral injury that had no name in military psychology textbooks, a wound to the soul that came not from facing danger but from realizing you had become danger itself, the burden of mercy, revealed itself in small acts of humanity that complicated the clean narrative of military victory and reminded everyone involved that beneath uniforms and flags and political rhetoric, all soldiers are fundamentally human beings capable of compassion even in the midst of war's worst horrors. American troops gave water to surrendering Iraqis who had been without clean drinking water for days, shared MRE rations with enemy soldiers who were literally starving, provided basic medical treatment for wounds that American weapons had inflicted. Some soldiers later described these moments with a kind of reverence, talking about the strange intimacy that exists between victor and defeated, the recognition of shared humanity that survives even when everything else has been destroyed. A young army medic spent hours treating an Iraqi soldier who had been badly burned in an airstrike, working with the same care and professionalism he would have shown to an American casualty. And when someone asked him later why he had invested so much effort in saving an enemy combatant, he replied with words that captured something profound about the ethical complexity of modern warfare, because he stopped being the enemy the moment he couldn't fight back anymore. These acts of mercy did not erase the killing that had preceded them, did not absolve anyone of responsibility for the highway of death or the thousands of Iraqi soldiers who died trying to escape. But they provided small points of light in a moral landscape that was otherwise almost unbearably dark. The tension between celebrating liberation and confronting the reality of what liberation had cost became impossible to ignore as images from Highway 80 began circulating in global media, forcing uncomfortable questions about the line between military necessity and excessive devastation. The Iraqi retreat had been militarily legitimate. A retreating army that remains armed and organized still poses a threat, and the laws of war permit attacking enemy forces until they formally surrender or are rendered combat ineffective. Yet the scale of destruction and the timing of the attacks coming after Iraqi resistance had effectively collapsed. After the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, raised questions that went beyond legal technicalities into the realm of moral philosophy and warrior ethics. If Vietnam had taught America the cost of fighting too long, of gradual escalation and mission creep and wars without clear objectives or endpoints, did Desert Storm perhaps teach a different but equally troubling lesson about winning too quickly, too cleanly, too decisively? Did the swift victory create an illusion that war could be surgical, that American technological superiority could achieve political objectives without the messy complications of occupation and reconstruction and long-term commitment? The haunting question that would echo through the decades following Desert Storm was whether the very decisiveness of the military victory had sown the seeds of future conflicts, whether the ease with which American power had destroyed Iraqi forces had created unrealistic expectations about what military force could accomplish, whether the 100-hour ground war had taught the wrong lessons to politicians and generals who would later commit American forces to conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq with the expectation of equally swift and clean victories. The homecoming parades began even before all the troops had returned from the desert, a nation hungry for heroes and desperate to celebrate a victory that seemed to vindicate decades of military investment and restore confidence shattered by Vietnam, rising up to welcome its warriors with yellow ribbons and ticker tape and speeches about duty and honor and the restoration of American military prowess. The soldiers marched through American cities to the sound of cheering crowds and marching bands, stood at attention while politicians praised their courage and sacrifice, smiled for cameras and waved to families, and accepted the gratitude of a grateful nation with the stoic grace that is expected of warriors returning from battle. Yet beneath the uniforms decorated with campaign ribbons and unit citations, beneath the outward displays of pride and accomplishment, many of these veterans carried invisible scars that no parade could heal and no medal could acknowledge. Wounds that had nothing to do with bullets or shrapnel, but everything to do with what they had seen and done and survived in those 48 hours of ground combat and the weeks of waiting that preceded them. The cruel paradox of Desert Storm was beginning to reveal itself even in those early days of celebration. That because the war had been so swift and the casualties so remarkably light by historical standards, the nation assumed there could be no lasting trauma, no psychological cost, no reason why these soldiers should not simply return to their previous lives and put the war behind them as easily as they removed their uniforms. The dismissal of Desert Storm veterans' struggles began almost immediately, rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of how trauma works and what combat does to the human psyche, regardless of duration or intensity. When veterans began reporting nightmares and anxiety and difficulty readjusting to civilian life, when they sought help from VA hospitals and counselors, they were often met with skepticism bordering on contempt, with questions that carried an implicit accusation of weakness or dishonesty. You were only there 100 hours. What trauma could you have? The underlying assumption was that post-traumatic stress required prolonged exposure to danger, that PTSD was something that happened to Vietnam veterans who spent year-long tours in the jungle, or World War II soldiers who fought through multiple campaigns, not to Desert Storm veterans who had participated in what was widely perceived as a nearly bloodless victory. This fundamental misconception about the nature of psychological injury created a secondary trauma, a betrayal that in some ways cut deeper than the original wounds, because it meant that these veterans' experiences were being invalidated, their suffering dismissed, their struggle to process what they had witnessed and participated in treated as illegitimate or exaggerated. The message they received, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, was that they had no right to be damaged by a war that had gone so well, that their pain was somehow less real because the war had been so short, that they should simply be grateful they survived and move on with their lives without complaint or assistance. The mysterious illnesses that began appearing among Gulf War veterans within months of their return home represented a different kind of wound, one that was physical rather than psychological, but equally devastating and equally dismissed by the military and medical establishments that should have been caring for them. Gulf War syndrome, as it came to be known, manifested in a bewildering array of symptoms that defied easy diagnosis or treatment. Chronic fatigue that left veterans unable to work or maintain relationships, cognitive difficulties that made concentration impossible, joint pain that turned simple physical activities into ordeals, respiratory problems that suggested exposure to toxic substances, neurological issues that affected memory and motor control. The potential causes were numerous and troubling. Exposure to chemical weapons during the air campaign, when American strikes on Iraqi chemical storage facilities may have released agents that drifted over coalition positions. Smoke from the 600 oil well fires that Saddam's retreating forces had ignited, filling the air with toxins that soldiers breathed for weeks. Experimental vaccines that had been administered without proper testing or informed consent, cocktails of anthrax and botulinum toxoid and other agents that may have had unforeseen interactions and side effects, depleted uranium from armor-piercing rounds, radioactive dust that soldiers inhaled or absorbed through skin contact, pesticides used liberally to control insects in the desert environment, nerve agent exposure from the demolition of Iraqi ammunition dumps. The list went on, and the uncertainty about causation made treatment nearly impossible and claims for disability benefits a bureaucratic nightmare. What made Gulf War syndrome particularly insidious was the way it represented a betrayal by the very institution that these veterans had trusted with their lives. A betrayal that suggested their government valued military effectiveness more than the long-term health and well-being of individual soldiers. The military had promised to protect them, had issued gas masks and mop gear and assured them that they would be kept safe from chemical and biological threats. Yet the reality was far more complicated and far less reassuring. Chemical detection alarms had sounded repeatedly during the war, but soldiers had been told the alarms were false positives, that there was no actual chemical threat, when in fact there was growing evidence that low-level exposure had occurred. The experimental vaccines had been presented as necessary protective measures, but soldiers were not given complete information about what they were being injected with or what the potential risks might be, were not allowed to refuse without facing disciplinary action, were treated as test subjects rather than as human beings with the right to informed consent. When veterans began falling ill and seeking answers, they encountered a wall of denial and bureaucratic obstruction, with the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs initially refusing to acknowledge that Gulf War syndrome even existed, dismissing veteran symptoms as psychosomatic or unrelated to their military service, creating additional layers of trauma and abandonment that compounded the original injuries, the nightmares that haunted Gulf War veterans. Decades after the war ended, revealed the true nature of the psychological wounds that brief wars can inflict, demonstrating that trauma is not primarily about duration of exposure, but about the intensity and moral complexity of what is experienced. Veterans described dreams that returned night after night, with the persistence of ghosts refusing to be laid to rest. Visions not of being shot at or wounded themselves, the kind of combat trauma that most people imagine, but rather of the faces of surrendering Iraqis. Young men with hands raised and eyes wide with terror. Boys who looked like they should have been in high school rather than in uniform. They dreamed of walking through the wreckage on Highway 80, of seeing bodies burned beyond recognition, of the smell of diesel and charred flesh that seemed to have permanently embedded itself in memory's archives. They dreamed of the moments when they realized they had become death itself, had participated in killing on a scale so massive and so one-sided that it challenged their fundamental understanding of themselves as good people, as warriors rather than murderers, as defenders of freedom rather than dealers of wholesale slaughter. These were not the nightmares of fear, of being afraid that you might die, but rather the nightmares of moral injury, of being forced to confront what you are capable of doing when orders and circumstances align, of recognizing that the capacity for violence exists within you in measures you never wanted to acknowledge. One veteran spent years trying to articulate what he had felt when he encountered a column of surrendering Iraqi soldiers, men so grateful to be taken prisoner that some of them kissed the hands of their American captors. And he finally found words that captured the essence of moral injury. I realized in that moment that we hadn't been fighting evil. We'd been fighting frightened kids who were caught in the same machinery we were, and I had been prepared to kill them without hesitation because that's what my training and my orders said to do. The fact that I didn't have to kill them doesn't change the fact that I would have, that I was willing to, that in my mind they were already dead before I ever saw their faces. How do you live with that? How do you go back to your normal life and pretend that knowledge doesn't exist inside you? This was the wound that no one wanted to acknowledge, because it complicated the narrative of righteous victory, because it suggested that even the good guys in a just war pay a moral price for the violence they inflict, because it meant that Desert Storm's swift success had not been costless after all, that the bill was simply coming due in installments paid in nightmares and broken marriages and substance abuse and suicide attempts and all the other ways that trauma manifests itself when it cannot find expression in socially acceptable forms. The lesson that should have been learned from Desert Storm but was instead systematically ignored by military planners and political leaders was that the apparent ease and speed of the victory had created a dangerous template for future conflicts, a seductive illusion that American technological superiority could achieve decisive military victories without the messy complications of occupation and nation-building and long-term commitment. The success of the air campaign and the 100-hour ground war seemed to prove that precision weapons and overwhelming force could topple enemy governments and destroy enemy militaries quickly and with minimal American casualties, and this apparent lesson would directly inform the decisions to invade Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 with inadequate forces and unrealistic expectations about how quickly stability could be achieved. The architects of these later conflicts looked at Desert Storm and saw a blueprint for rapid victory, failing to understand that Desert Storm's objectives had been limited and clearly defined: liberate Kuwait, destroy Iraqi military capabilities, do not occupy Iraq or attempt regime change, and that expanding those objectives to include nation-building and counterinsurgency would require fundamentally different strategies and resources. The lie written in the blood of the next generation was that war could be quick and clean and cheap, that American military power could reshape the Middle East without the kind of long-term commitment and sacrifice that previous generations had understood as the inevitable cost of warfare. Yet, despite all the pain and betrayal and abandonment, despite the mysterious illnesses and unacknowledged trauma and cultural amnesia that treated Desert Storm as a footnote rather than a defining event, the bond between veterans who had served together during those 48 hours remained unbreakable, forged in shared experience and mutual understanding that no civilian could fully comprehend. Veterans described staying in touch with their unit members years and decades after the war, calling each other during difficult times, attending reunions where they could be around people who understood without explanation what they had been through and what they continued to carry. One veteran explained it with words that captured something essential about the nature of warrior bonds. "We went to hell together, even if it only lasted 48 hours. That's more real than any friendship I've made since. These are the people who saw me at my worst and my best, who know what I'm capable of, and who I really am underneath all the civilian bullshit. When I'm with them, I don't have to pretend or explain or apologize. They just know." This enduring connection represented perhaps the one unambiguously positive legacy of Desert Storm, the creation of a brotherhood that transcended the trauma and disappointment and betrayal, a circle of belonging that provided meaning and purpose and mutual support in ways that the larger society could not or would not. The cultural amnesia surrounding Desert Storm revealed itself in the way the war virtually disappeared from public consciousness within just a few years, overshadowed first by the decade of relative peace and prosperity that followed, and then completely eclipsed by the September 11 attacks and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that dominated the first decade of the 21st century. Desert Storm veterans found themselves in a strange, liminal space, neither fully honored like World War II veterans whose sacrifices had saved civilization, nor fully acknowledged like Vietnam veterans whose trauma had at least been recognized, even if poorly addressed. They were the forgotten middle generation, their service minimized because the war had gone too well, their struggles dismissed because victory had come so swiftly, their sacrifices overlooked because they occurred during a conflict that most Americans preferred to remember as a triumph rather than as a complex moral event with lasting consequences. The cruelty of this amnesia lay in the implicit message it sent to these veterans, that even success can feel like abandonment, that winning decisively provides no protection against being forgotten, that a grateful nation's gratitude has a remarkably short half-life. Some veterans described feeling as if they had served in a war that had never quite happened, an event that existed in historical records but had left no mark on the national consciousness. And this sense of erasure added another layer of injury to wounds that had never properly healed in the first place. 34 years have passed since those 48 hours of ground combat that changed the face of modern warfare. And yet the echoes of Desert Storm continue to reverberate through American military doctrine, foreign policy calculations, and the lives of veterans who carry that war within them like a weight that never quite settles, never quite becomes manageable, never quite transforms into memory that can be safely archived and forgotten. The central truth that emerges from any honest reckoning with Desert Storm is that duration does not determine impact, that a war can be measured in hours rather than years, and still reshape everything that follows, still create wounds that take lifetimes to understand, still force questions about the nature of victory and the cost of freedom that have no easy answers. When we calculate what was won and what was lost in those brief days of combat, the ledger becomes almost impossibly complex. Kuwait was liberated and returned to its ruling family. American military superiority was demonstrated beyond any doubt, and the ghosts of Vietnam were at least partially exorcised. A generation of soldiers proved their courage and competence under fire and came home to a nation that celebrated rather than condemned them. Yet the regional stability that the war was supposed to secure proved illusory, with Saddam Hussein remaining in power for another 12 years and the seeds of future conflicts already germinating in the desert sand. The illusion that war could be clean and surgical and accomplished with precision weapons and minimal casualties created expectations that would lead directly to the disasters of Afghanistan and Iraq, where American forces would discover that technological superiority means nothing in counterinsurgency warfare and that nation-building cannot be accomplished from 30,000 feet. And thousands of veterans returned home carrying invisible wounds, Gulf War syndrome, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, the weight of having participated in killing on a scale they never anticipated and never fully processed. That would diminish their lives and shorten their lifespans in ways that no casualty statistics captured. Stephen E. Ambrose spent his career documenting the experiences of American soldiers in World War II, and running through all his work like a golden thread was a core belief that he articulated most clearly in Band of Brothers, that the true measure of any war is not the territory conquered or the enemy defeated, not the strategic objectives achieved or the political outcomes secured, but rather the character it reveals in those who fight it and whether they come home whole in body and spirit. By this measure, Desert Storm presents a deeply ambiguous legacy, because while it revealed tremendous courage and professionalism and competence in the American military, while it demonstrated that ordinary citizens could be transformed into highly effective warriors through training and leadership and commitment to mission, it also revealed the terrible cost of one-sided warfare, the moral injury that comes from killing without danger, the psychological burden of technological superiority so absolute that combat ceases to feel like combat and begins to feel like execution. The soldiers who fought in Desert Storm came home physically intact in numbers that would have been unimaginable. In any previous American conflict, only 148 Americans killed in action during the entire war. A casualty rate so low, it seemed to validate every investment in precision weapons and advanced training. Yet many of them did not come home whole, did not come home unchanged, did not come home to lives that could simply resume, as if those 48 hours had never happened. The character revealed in them was authentic courage and genuine competence, but it was also confusion about what they had participated in. Guilt about the asymmetry of the killing, anger at being dismissed when they tried to articulate their struggles, and a profound sense of having been used by a nation that celebrated their victory, but had no interest in understanding their wounds. Carl Marlantes served as a Marine officer in Vietnam and spent the next 40 years trying to understand what that experience had done to him and to his fellow warriors. And in his memoir, What It Is Like to Go to War, he articulated a truth that applies with particular force to Desert Storm veterans. that combat creates wounds which take decades to understand, that 48 hours of warfare can generate 48 years of processing and grief and struggle, and that a nation which sends its young people into battle has an obligation to sit with them in that darkness, not just at the victory parades and medal ceremonies, but in the long, silent decades that follow, when the cameras have moved on and the politicians have found new causes to champion. This is perhaps the most profound failure of the Desert Storm legacy, the unwillingness of American society to acknowledge that even swift victories exact a price, that even wars that go well by military standards still damage the warriors who fight them, that technological superiority cannot protect soldiers from the psychological and moral costs of participating in organized violence. Malantes wrote that warriors return from combat carrying knowledge about themselves and about human nature that civilians can never fully understand. Knowledge about what human beings are capable of doing to each other when circumstances align, about how thin the veneer of civilization really is, about how quickly ordinary people can become instruments of death when trained and ordered and placed in situations where killing is not just permitted, but expected. Desert Storm veterans carry this knowledge, but unlike Vietnam veterans whose struggles eventually became culturally acknowledged and whose sacrifices were eventually honored, Desert Storm veterans have largely been left to process this knowledge alone, to integrate these experiences into their lives without societal support or recognition, to make sense of what they did and what it meant without the benefit of national conversation or collective memory. The uncomfortable question that hangs over Desert Storm's legacy like smoke from burning oil wells is whether the very success of the operation made future wars inevitable, whether the swift, decisive victory taught precisely the wrong lessons to the political and military leaders who would make decisions in the years that followed. Did the ease with which American forces destroyed Iraqi military capabilities in 1991 create the arrogance that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003? The belief that American power could reshape entire societies through military force alone? The assumption that technological superiority could substitute for careful planning and adequate troop levels and realistic assessment of the challenges involved in occupation and reconstruction? The answer appears to be yes. The Desert Storm created a template which subsequent leaders misapplied catastrophically, failing to understand that the limited objectives and clear mission of liberating Kuwait bore no resemblance to the open-ended commitment of overthrowing regimes and building democracies in societies with no history of democratic governance. The lie that was written in the blood of the next generation, the soldiers who would fight in Afghanistan for 20 years and Iraq for nearly a decade, who would experience casualty rates and trauma levels that dwarfed Desert Storm, who would discover that winning battles means nothing if you cannot win the peace, was that military power could solve complex political problems quickly and cleanly and with minimal long-term commitment. Desert Storm's success created this illusion, and thousands of American service members paid the price for the delusion that followed. Yet to focus only on the failures and costs and unlearned lessons would be to dishonor something essential about what those 48 hours represented. Something that deserves to be remembered and honored, even as we acknowledge the complexity and ambiguity of the legacy. The soldiers who fought in Desert Storm demonstrated genuine courage, not the Hollywood version of courage that involves dramatic acts of heroism in the face of overwhelming odds, but the quieter, more profound courage of doing your job under stress, of taking care of your brothers, of following orders even when you are terrified, of maintaining your humanity and compassion even in circumstances designed to strip away everything except the capacity for violence. They proved that American military power, when properly trained and properly led and properly resourced, could accomplish objectives that seemed impossible, could achieve victories that previous generations would have considered miraculous. They showed that precision weapons and advanced technology, when combined with professional soldiers who understand rules of engagement and value civilian lives, could wage war in ways that minimized collateral damage and unnecessary suffering. These are real achievements, genuine sources of pride, legitimate reasons for a nation to honor those who served. The tragedy is not that these achievements are meaningless, but rather that they have been overshadowed by what followed, by the ways their success was misused and misunderstood, by the failure to recognize that even in victory the cost is real and the wounds are lasting, and the obligation to care for warriors extends far beyond the moment. When the shooting stops, the eternal flame that should burn in memory of Desert Storm is not a flame of uncomplicated triumph or simple glory, but rather a more complex fire that illuminates both the nobility of service and the cost of warfare, both the genuine courage of those who fought and the genuine wounds they carried home, both the military victory that was achieved and the human price that was paid. To honor the sacrifice of those 48 hours means refusing to glorify war even as we honor warriors, means acknowledging that behind every successful mission were human beings who carried fear and pulled triggers and watched people die and came home changed in ways that no victory parade could heal. It means remembering that the young pilots who flew into hostile airspace, and the young soldiers who crossed into Kuwait, and the young Marines who liberated Kuwait City were not superhuman warriors incapable of doubt or trauma, but rather ordinary Americans who found within themselves the extraordinary capacity to face danger and do their duty and maintain their humanity under circumstances that tested them to their limits. It means understanding that technological superiority does not eliminate the moral burden of warfare, that precision weapons do not prevent psychological wounds, that swift victory does not mean costless victory. Most of all, it means committing ourselves to sit with our warriors in their darkness, to bear witness to their truth rather than just their triumph, to acknowledge that even the best executed military operations create wounds that take generations to heal. An aging Desert Storm veteran stands at a memorial wall, his weathered hand tracing the engraved name of a brother who did not come home. And in that gesture is contained everything we need to understand about the war and its legacy. Time has not healed these wounds. 34 years is somehow both a lifetime and no time at all. Long enough for that young soldier to become an old man, but not long enough for the memories to fade, or the questions to find answers, or the pain to transform into something manageable. Distance has not diminished the bond. The brother whose name is carved into stone is as present in this moment as he was in the Saudi desert all those decades ago, death having no power to sever connections forged in shared danger and mutual sacrifice. The truest honor we can give to those who served in Desert Storm is not to mythologize their experience or simplify their legacy, not to treat their war as either uncomplicated triumph or meaningless exercise, but rather to bear witness to the full complexity of what they endured and what they carry still, to acknowledge both their courage and their wounds, to remember both their victory and its cost. They went to war for 48 hours, but they have been coming home ever since, and they will be coming home for the rest of their lives. And the question that confronts us as a nation is whether we will be there to receive them, whether we will honor not just their service, but their truth, whether we will finally learn the lesson that every generation of warriors tries to teach, that war is never clean, victory is never free, and the debt we owe to those who fight in our name can never be fully repaid, but must, nevertheless, be acknowledged in every generation, until the last veteran comes home and the last story is told, and the last name is spoken aloud so that none of them are forgotten.